Hi, everybody. This is Nick Berbulis. I am the editor of Educational Theory. We're doing a series of interviews with authors who have published papers in the journal. Today's guest is Glenn Bezalel from Cambridge University. He wrote a paper published recently called On Controversies and Conspiracies, a Pedagogy of Conspiracy Theories. Obviously, everyone is concerned about the spread of conspiracy theories online and in other venues. It's really distorting our politics in all sorts of ways. And Glenn's paper could hardly be more timely in its topic. Glenn, thanks for joining us. Can you please start by giving us an overview of the basic argument of the paper and why you took on this topic at this point in time?
Good to be with you, Nick. Thanks so much. So the interest in the paper was really both on a personal and also on a professional level. Personally, I come from a Jewish background, and I suppose, as long as I can remember, I was brought up really on terrible conspiracy theories against Jewish people, whether it was the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the notion that Jews through a secret conspiracy run the world, whether it's the blood libels of the medieval period, or in more recent history, the notion of Holocaust revisionism, that the Holocaust was a hoax. So really, from a personal level, I came towards conspiracy theories instinctually very much as a skeptic, as a sense that this is something that only very strange extremists or wackos sort of take to. But professionally, I suppose, in my research, I started to consider that perhaps we could have a more nuanced understanding, because perhaps if we start to really pick at the individual conspiracies, then I think we can start to realize there's actually quite a range here. And yes, there are those extreme sort of crazy and sort of extremist conspiracies that we're aware of, whether it's from Holocaust revisionism to the idea that the moon landings were a hoax. But at the same time, as far back as you want to go in human history, we can recognize that conspiracies do happen. Speaking to you, you're in the US, and obviously Watergate was a huge part of modern American history. And there you have it. That was a conspiracy that took part the heart of US governmental power. In more recent times, we not only have governments, but also corporations like Volkswagen who conspired in the emissions scandal to hide what they were doing for profit motives. So we know that when people get together, especially perhaps people in powerful authoritative positions, they do conspire, and there are conspiracy theories that are true. And so as I started to look at this, I started to think about how we can start to try and get a more nuanced picture, certain educational and pedagogical terms, with regards to conspiracy theories, and especially how perhaps they could provide real opportunities, as well as the challenges, as you mentioned before, that they certainly have on our democratic education and on critical thinking. And so really the aims of this paper were twofold. One was an exploration. It was to get the conversation started. Oddly enough, even though conspiracy theories, as you said, are so widespread out there in the public sphere, yes, they've started to take root in wider academic discourse amongst many different fields, especially in psychology and in socio-political research. But within education, actually, there really isn't much out there. And so this paper, I hope, will begin that conversation. But the main thrust of the argument, in a sense, and perhaps we can explore this further, was, as I said before, is to suggest that this sort of generalist sweeping notion that we can just dismiss conspiracy theories actually, I think, could harm democratic discourse. It actually, in a sense, lets people in power off the hook. And I think there is a new, perhaps a fine line between thinking about what may be that sort of absurd naivety when it comes to conspiracy theories, and actually recognizing that sometimes conspiracy theories could play an important role for critical thinking and for holding people in power to account.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Glenn. Thank you. Of course, some of the believers of some of the more wacky conspiracy theories think that's what they're doing, that they're holding people in power to account. So from a pedagogical standpoint, then how do we help students to sort out, students and others, to sort out these two different kinds of conspiracy theories. One is legitimate, even true conspiracy theories, and the wacky, delusionary ones that are sort of more prominent in the news today.
Yeah, absolutely. And not this is a very difficult question, not just for students, but I think for all of us out there in society, whether in academia, also in the media itself. And that's a really interesting question. How can we distinguish between those sort of warranted conspiracy theories and those unwarranted ones that, as you say, perhaps the more extremists may be latching onto? And I think there are sort of healthy rules of thumb here that perhaps we could look at. And I would say perhaps the way we could help students is along three levels. The first is the epistemic. Secondly, is also to recognize the conspiracy theories absolutely impact on us on an existential level. And then thirdly, also on a social level, to recognize the role it can play there. So I'll go through those each in order. Certainly epistemic level, what we want to perhaps provide for students are the critical thinking tools for them, as you said, to delineate between what might be a reasonable or warranted conspiracy theory and perhaps those that are unwarranted and that we can perhaps, come to recognize quite quickly this is something we need to be more skeptical about. And Sir Richard Evans at Cambridge, who has explored this area quite a bit, he perhaps, I think, helpfully distinguishes between what he calls event conspiracies and global conspiracies. That event, perhaps more local conspiracies, like the example you mentioned of the Volkswagen emissions scandal, those already we can see could be more likely. There is, I think, reasonable room for doubt when it comes to perhaps believing those in power. And we should hold them to that sort of skeptical lens that I think is fruitful, whether it's for the media or for researchers as well. And so when it comes to local event conspiracies, already we can start to see that it could be perhaps that bit more reasonable. But when it comes to global conspiracies, I mentioned before the protocols of the Elders of Zion, but perhaps we could talk about, the moon landing, for example, the notion that all of NASA, 50,000 employees in 1969, 1970, were all in on this conspiracy, the suggestion that the moon landings were fake. That's already, it's just that you can hold thousands of people to swear them to secrecy. Already we're starting to get into the realms of the absurd. So I think those sort of epistemic rules of thumb are really helpful for us, certainly in the classroom context, to provide those critical thinking skills for our students and how to start to make those differences. Let's now turn to the existential level. We have to recognize, I think, that conspiracy theories, it'll be too narrow to think of them purely in that sort of reasonable, evidential approach. And actually, much like other very strongly held beliefs, conspiracy theories go to the heart of who we are as individuals. And I think we can draw on really interesting work in the philosophy of religion, for example. Think about how religion not just play out in terms of our epistemic beliefs about the world, but very much on a very deeply personal existential worldview for many of us. And so even if we're presented with arguments that may go very much against our religious beliefs, nevertheless, for many of us, those religious beliefs will stay strong and we will stand by them because of perhaps higher sense of loyalty to the religion that we have. To draw on, for example, R.M. Hare's notion of a blick. I'll spell that out, B-L-I-K. But this concept is a notion of an unfalsifiable but very meaningful belief. And I think those sort of beliefs are very important for us, whether it's religious beliefs, could be conspiratorial, could be very personal beliefs that we may have that actually really do shape much of our lives and how we choose to live our lives. And conspiracy theories certainly, I think, have to be understood and taught and learnt about at that existential level as well. And then finally, the social level. We know, for example, that people hold deeply held beliefs just based on the culture that they belong to, the milieu that they are working within. And one interesting example could be to do with climate change, for example. We know that there is a political divide. It's not down, by the way, to really interesting research done by Dan Kahan and others show that often we think of people that hold anti-climate realist views and perhaps seen as the skeptics, and well, it's a deficiency in their education. But study after study shows that's just not true. It's very much more down to their political affiliations. And because in recent years, climate change, concern for climate change has been very much linked with the liberal cause, well, that then creates that default skepticism amongst more conservative people with regards to climate change. So just shouting louder the evidence at such people actually has not just a neutral effect, but could actually backfire. Rather, if we educate at not just the epistemic levels, but also the social and existential at the existential levels, I think we're going to have much better outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, this is your project, not mine, but my inclination is to think that in many cases, what you're calling the existential and social drivers are in fact the primary reasons why people believe certain things, and the epistemic or evidentiary considerations actually follow from beliefs that are held because they have other kinds of appeal, and then the reasons get shaped or the evidence gets shaped to fit the beliefs.
Yeah, I absolutely concur with that, and I think really interesting work and research has been done by the psychologist John Haidt, The Righteous Mind, who shows very much that the intuitive is what is dragging along, as it were, the epistemic and reason, and it absolutely goes against perhaps our perhaps the message of the Enlightenment, this notion that it's evidence, and as rational beings, we always follow the evidence. But I think conspiracy theory is a good example that show actually it's quite the opposite.
Yeah, thank you for that. Glenn, thank you for the time. I do want to urge people to read the entire article. It's rich and full of a lot of ideas that we didn't have time to get to in this short interview. The topic could not be more important and more timely. So thank you for this paper, and it's a pleasure to get a chance to talk with you.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you, Nick.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.